Hey guys, Gareth here from Intense Architect, and I'd like to start by welcoming you to the first video in our fundamentals training series. And this is a series where we're going to take you guys step by step through how to build real world applications using Intense Architect, where these applications will follow very specific architectures and patterns. And as part of this particular workshop, I'm going to show you guys how we can set up our first solution and our first application with some very, very basic use case in place. So let's jump right in. I'm going to start by clicking the Create New Solution button over here. We get to pick our architecture template. For the training workshops, we're going to focus on the clean architecture. This is a fantastic architecture, by the way. If you're not familiar with it, it is tried and tested in the software space. It's very, very robust. It's got some of the best metrics around things like testability and maintainability. So it's really a fantastic architecture for us to work with. I'm going to just click on that, and this is now going to take us to our solution naming setup. So we're going to call our solution training, for example, and our application name for this workshop we'll call My Shop. And the reason for that is because as part of these workshops, we're going to be building out an e-shop. This is a great domain. Everybody should be relatively familiar with it because we've all done some online shopping. And so it's really a domain that most developers should understand intuitively. Next, what we can do here is we can go and select out our components. And this is where we really have an opportunity to pick the default patterns that we want to use for this new My Shop application. I'm going to leave all of the defaults in place. We're going to have a controller pattern, mediator, application services, automapper, fluent validation, of course, entities. We'll use entity framework for these workshops. For the time being, we could take a look at other technologies in later workshops. And if we needed to, we can bring in integration. If, for example, we're building microservices, we could bring in integration patterns and technologies, and so on and so forth. And like I said, we're going to take all the defaults for now. This is not set in stone. Once we select these, we can change all of these decisions later. So for now, let's just take the defaults and click at the bottom right over here, Create Solution. What that's going to do for us is it's going to set up our solution called training. And as you can see, we've got our application over here. Now, one thing I can point out is that if I want to add another application later, I can just right click on the solution and select Create New Application, and it's going to launch up the same dialog wizard for me over here, which we can then use to create our next application. As you can see, we get to once again pick and choose what architecture we want to follow, what patterns we want to use. And so every single application can in fact be following its own completely unique architecture. And in a microservice architecture, that is a very desirable situation because each microservice could be architected very specifically to meet the non-functional requirements of that particular microservice, just as an example. All right, guys. So one other thing I can also just point out here, which is important, is if I right click on the application, you can see I've got some options here. The one I want to point out is the Manage Modules. If I select this, it's going to take me to the Modules tab. This is where we get to change our patterns. We get to browse for new patterns. We get to view the installed patterns. If there are any updates, we can select the updates, and we can see if there are any updates available for us. So this is really where we can alter which patterns we're using. We can remove patterns if we need to. We can upgrade and downgrade patterns. So this is really where we get our control of our architecture, and we can be changing this and shifting this around much, much later in this application's lifecycle, years into it, even when it's become a very, very big application. And this is how we achieve the architectural agility that so many teams are missing when they're building out their software systems. Now, guys, at this point, we don't have a code base. If we want Intense Architect to act on a code base, we need to run the software factory execution, which I can click on over here at the very top. And what you see it does there is it does some processing, and then it's going to list out the changes that it wants to make to my code base. Now, these changes have not happened yet. That's because our philosophy is that Intense Architect will never, ever touch the code base without your direct consent as a developer. So these are all here for staging purposes. And if we're interested to see what code is going to be generated here, we can double click any of these files, for example, the program, and we can see the actual code that Intense Architect wants to write here. Now, on the left is blank. That's because there's no code base. And on the right is the code Intense Architect wants to write. We call this the projection, just by the way. And you can use any diff tool. I just like Visual Studio Code. And so that's the diff tool that we'll be using as part of these videos. So the one thing I can just mention here is that this code that is coming in, this code is being generated by the deterministic pattern reuse systems. It's extremely fast. It is 100% deterministic. And so we can trust that the code that's being written out here is reliable. It's validated. It's been validated by senior developers and architects already all over the world. And so we can really trust what we're getting here. And that's very, very key because it means that we don't need to inspect every last line of code that is being generated. We can just allow ourselves to accept these changes with the trust that what is being placed forward here, if we know our patterns, and we do recommend, by the way, just going through these patterns, that if we know that we're happy with them, we can just say apply changes with confidence that they are correct. Okay, guys, so we've got to apply those changes. If we want to open up our code base, we can click this link at the bottom over here. And there is our SLN. I can double click that and we can launch that up. While that's loading up in the background, one thing I can point out here is if I just go one up in my folder structure to the training um, folder over here, you can see that I've got my shop folder with all of our code. This is pure code. I could share this with you. You'll be able to download it, of course, and create it for yourself. And you'll see that this code you can run without any dependency whatsoever. There are no dependencies that Intent Architect is introducing that are specific to Intent Architect. And the second thing that I could point out over here is that we have this intent folder. And inside of this folder, this is where the metadata and the blueprints will be stored. And so we can check both of these into version control. And by the way, the default structure is, as you can see, it's presented, but you could change this default structure. Some teams like to, for example, put this intent folder directly inside of the application and various other configurations. All right. What I can just also point out here is that we've got our application that is being generated. This is essentially a bootstrapping. And if we go through all of this code, you can see it follows a clean architecture structure with the domain or the core project being completely technology agnostic. We've got our application project over here. This is for our verbs, essentially, the actions that we want to take on our application. This is also as technology agnostic as we can make it. And then we've got our two technology layers or projects, which is our API and our infrastructure. So very, very true to the clean architecture structure. The naming conventions and structure of this are completely configurable. So if this is not your default naming convention, we will in a later workshop cover how you can customize this completely. Okay, guys, so this bootstrapping is done. Let's get into making this application actually do something. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to double click on the domain designer. And we could start by modeling out our first entity. So I'm just going to right click on the diagram. By the way, this is the general paradigm. You want to right click on the diagram to do your first actions or whenever you're starting a new use case, for example. And we could say new entity. And this is going to create us a new entity, which we can name customer. So we're going to start by modeling out our customer. I will type customer and push enter. And now we have our customer entity. We can then right click on this entity and we could say add attribute and we can call this name. And now we've added our first attribute, which will be the name for this customer. Now, a very useful shortcut that is worth knowing in Intent Architect is the Control Enter shortcut. If you hit Control Enter, what it's going to do is it's going to create a new version of whatever you have selected, right? So it's not a duplicate. It's just create me a new instance of whatever I have selected. And so we can just say Control Enter and type surname, enter, and we've got our surname. And once again, we could say Control Enter and we could type out our email address, enter, and we could say this is all the information that we want for our customer for the time being. So we could push save or click this button at the top. And the other option is, of course, Control S. And what you'll notice is that the Software Factory execution that we had open, it's minimized to the taskbar over here. And every time we push save, it kicks it off in the background. And once it's finished processing, if there are changes it wants to make to our underlying code base, it will start to flash. Okay. If the Software Factory has been shut down, not a problem. Just click the Software Factory button at the top over here, and it'll kick it off again, and you could just minimize it if you'd like to keep it running. Now, one thing that is important to understand is every time we run the Software Factory execution, a good way to think about this is that what we're doing is we are realizing our architecture and our patterns and the design of our system. We're realizing that all into the code base at that moment. So our designs in the context of the architecture realized into the code base through each Software Factory execution. And here what we can see is that this new design that we've added, the entity, its repository itself, you could call this is an aggregate root fundamentally at this point. The changes to the dependency injection and our DB context, of course, we can double click these and see what these changes are. So here we can see, by the way, in the entity framework, we've got the DB set being registered over there, or at least declared, and then the customer configuration being registered. Just going to Alt-Tab back. And we can go through all of these files, but I'll leave you guys to do that in your own time as you inspect out this architecture. For now, we can just say apply changes. And we can then click back here and we are essentially done with creating our first entity. Next, let's go set up some services to act on this entity. So a really nice, clean, and easy way for us to do this is to hover over the customer. You'll see we get a suggestions icon over here. These are usually very, very useful suggestions that would be most likely actions that you may want to take on a particular element in any one of the designers inside of Intent Architect. And here we can see that the two suggestions that are available is to create some CRUD CQRS operations or to create CRUD traditional services. So let's just stick to this top one over here and create some CRUD CQRS operations. I'm going to click that. What that's going to do is it's going to take me over to the services designer. It's going to bring up this pop-up to say, well, which operations would you like to create? Which diagram would you like to add it to? And I'll just leave all the defaults and say done. And what this will do is it'll go and set up 3 commands for me: a create, a delete, and an update command for my customer, and a get customers by ID, or get customer by ID, should I say, and a get customers query, which is going to return us a list. We can just expand all of these just to get a bit more of a view here. It's going to return us the customer's DTO as a collection. Now we can say save once again or Control S. I've just pushed Control S over there. Software Factory is running in the background. We can click it. You can see here's all of our changes. And you can go through all of these changes too. We've got our commands, our handlers, and our validators. This is, of course, one version of the pattern. Another version of this does collapse these all together. So you can just pick and choose how you want this to work. And I'll show you guys in later workshops these kinds of options. But for now, we can just say apply changes. And all of that code, if we come to our code base, is now available to us. So there's our customer use cases, our entities, our configuration for entity framework. And the last thing that we want to do here is let's go and select all of these endpoints. There we go. And we can right click and say expose as HTTP endpoint. And what that's going to do is it's going to add a little icon over here. This is very useful because now we know that this is exposed. It's also going to tell us the verb and the root. It's going to show that to us so that we've got much better visibility on which of our services are exposed to the outside world. And if we would like to edit this, we could just click on this icon and we could see what we could change the verb, we could change the root. We could also do that in the properties pane on the right over here. And so we can just go and configure this out and customize these defaults however we'd like. One thing that is also worth just mentioning is if we want to add new commands and queries, which we will do in later workshops, we can go ahead and do that too at this point. Now, let's just go ahead and say save or Control S. Software Factory is going to run, and we could just bring up the changes that it wants to initiate here. You can see that what it's going to set up for us is our controller for the customer. And if you are following a controller pattern, I'm sure at least in a clean architecture, this is exactly what it would look like with our endpoints, the metadata for our Swagger UI, for example, receiving in the command, in the case of the create customer command, dispatching it on the mediator, getting the ID back and returning it as a 201, just as an example. All right, we can go ahead and say apply changes. We can come back to our code base. There's our controllers. We can now compile this application. And this application will then run for us. And it'll launch up our Swagger UI because that's one of the patterns that was installed by default. And here's our Swagger UI with our customer endpoints. And let's go ahead and hit these endpoints. I'm going to try this out, and I'm going to call myself Gareth as my name, Baars as my surname, and Gareth at intentarchitect.com. And we can go and execute that. I'm going to execute it 2 more times. So I'll create myself 3 times in the system. And we can try this out, and we can execute that. And there we can see I've got my data coming back. I'm actually 3 times in the system. At a later stage, we can go and put unique constraints and ensure that you can't create yourself multiple times in the system. But for now, this is just to get ourselves set up and just to show you guys an initial use case. You can, of course, go and hit these other endpoints. By the way, you may be wondering, where is this data stored? I can quickly show you that because we're going to change that in later workshops. And that is that if I just say Control T or hit the search button over here, I can type database, and there it is, database provider, and I can say enter. And that's going to take me to the database provider over here, which is in memory. And we'll be changing this to a different provider in the later workshops. All right, guys, that's the end of this particular workshop. Thanks for joining, and we'll be covering the domain modeling in a lot more detail in the next workshop. Looking forward to it and hope to see you there. All the best. Cheers.